Welcome to the About Us podcast show where we explore the stories, identities, and inner landscapes that shape the human experience. I'm your host, Carl Allen. Today's guest has devoted his life to understanding some of the oldest and most enduring stories ever told. Nitten Nair is the founder of MythLok, a global platform that brings the world's mythologies into the present day with clarity and creativity. After nearly 2 decades in the corporate world, he stepped away to follow a passion he had carried since childhood. He was now a storyteller, writer, and content creator who explores gods, heroes, and cosmic forces from every corner of the world. He is also a certified life and career coach, drawing from both ancient narratives and his own journey to inspire Today we'll explore global mythology, why these stories endure, and what they teach us about ourselves. Nitten, welcome to the All About Us podcast show. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much, Carl. It's a real pleasure to be on your show, and it's been great. Wonderful day so far, and hopefully it'll continue for the rest of the week.
That's good. This is going to be a very interesting show because now I'll actually get to speak to someone about some of my theories, involving ancient history, how it intermingles with religion, and what's that division between, fact, folk, and fairy tale. And so this is going to be a very, very interesting show for me. Origins of a storyteller. Okay, can you share how your love for mythology began?
I was born and brought up in Dubai. As a kid, my dad used to work there, and I've lived there for, I'm 15, 16 years when I was a kid. But every year during my holidays, I used to come home to India. And at that time, the late 80s, early 90s, electricity wasn't as, everywhere as it is today. So we were from a small village. I spent all my time with my grandmothers in the evening because there wasn't anything to do. There was no video games or anything. So all we did was she used to keep telling me stories. Yeah, stories from mythology, stuff that she knew of. So whether it was the Ramayana or the Mahabharata or any Indian mythology that she had access to, she used to tell me the stories. And that really created, yeah.
So you're familiar with the Mahabharata?
Yes.
Lord Brahma, the creator god, and Lord Vishnu. We're going to have a very interesting conversation today, but continue on.
Yeah. So, for me, during those days as a child, my best memories of my vacations or in that year were the evenings spent with my grandmothers, both my grandmothers, my dad's mom and my mother's mom. They're brilliant storytellers, and it just got me hooked onto it. And then as you grow, your taste evolves, your ability to do research on your own evolves. And I just kept going. It wasn't something that I ever shut out.
Okay, what brought you toward world mythologies rather than staying within one tradition?
Well, it was probably the fact that, I grew up in Dubai. It's a multicultural city, one of, the most amazing cities out there. And I had friends from all different cultures. So when I used to talk to them and I tell them, listen, have you heard of this? And have you heard of that? They weren't very aware of different stories. So then I literally had to ask them, what their stories were. And then, there's always the academic version of it where you are introduced to Greek and Roman mythology at a young age as part of history and literature. So that became, my entry point there. And then you take up Discovery Channel or any of the other channels out there. Egyptian mythology was one of the main focus at one point of time, the pyramids and Sphinx, etc. So that became the next thing. And it was just one after the other. You get introduced to it, you get hooked onto it, and then you just continue.
Well, yeah, and it's kind of an interesting thing because you didn't just stick with, the Mahabharata, and all of the rich history there that goes back thousands of years. You started getting into Greek and Roman mythology and all of these other different mythologies. And when you start even studying, even coming to the South America, the Mayas, the Incas, and all of that, what you will see is all of them talk about teachers, either seven teachers or 11 teachers who traveled to all of these different cultures and taught
Exactly.
man. We're talking about the Sumerians, Then we're talking about the Indians. Then we're talking about the Egyptians, talking about the Aborigines in Australia, talking about the Mayans and the Incas in South America. How do they all, in separate parts of the world, had this same backdrop stories of seven powerful teachers who came from the heavens to teach man
Well, if
everything?
you look at it, yeah, so basically, like, I have a theory about it. It's basically the fact that we today try to conflate or try to bring together and try to build a common narrative that connects mythology, culture, history, religion, everything when it's related to the past. We just try to box them all under one. But if you look at it, you mentioned all these amazing cultures. But if you look at it, yes, there's always a teacher. But then the lessons that these teachers taught were always, the same. There's always agriculture, there's always fire, there's always technology. They talked about the same things. Well, we could say that the Incas and Mayas were connected by a common landmass. But then how do you explain Easter Island? How do you explain Hawaii? How do you explain the different mythology that's available in the Philippines? We call them one country, but every island has a different mythology and a story behind it. So it's all human beings, and what they thought was the explanation or answers to their problems in the day. They put it out as stories. For them, it was all stories and a belief system that they did it. But today, we try to just club everything together and box it up because it's easier.
Okay, now my question to you is, do you believe all of this was just fictional stories, or do you actually believe there were some facts behind the stories that they created about these 7 to 11 teachers?
Carl, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that last bit.
Okay, I said, do you believe all of those stories were fictional, or do you believe there's some truth or some fact behind those stories?
Well, it was fact for them when they
Okay.
in their times. So, I always give this example, like, 500 years from now, people might think that the Lord of the Rings was our, mythology, or Game of Thrones is our history. So it's basically, we really don't know. We don't actually have anything to prove that they were facts or they're fiction. But if you look at even modern religion today, there are people who, you know, support it very strongly. There are people completely against it. But once again, it's all stories. If you look at them as stories of cultures, then everything makes sense. Because even today, we're trying to make sense from what we know about what happens around us. They did the same thing 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, whenever. So people actually saw something and built stories around it. And that was their way of passing on that information or their knowledge. It was oral traditions and stuff. Today, it's digital. Today, it's TV. We have books. We have everything. In the future, it might be something else. So I wouldn't go out and say that, yes, it's fact, it's fiction. I would say definitely it's stories. It's definitely something they believed in. But we really don't know enough to know whether giants actually helped build, different structures.
Okay. Well, you look back. Was there a moment when you realized you wanted to pursue storytelling full time?
Well, full time, well, I would say that was quite recent. I was actually doing a small seminar as part of being a coach. And then I realized that throughout all my training sessions, I include a lot of mythological stories. And that's the part that whoever was part of these sessions really enjoyed. So I thought, why not? Let's focus on the stories and let's do that full time. And there is no shortage of material. So, it gives you plenty of stuff to work on, plenty of stuff to study, plenty of stuff to research. And as MythLok became more and more bigger, it became more and more prominent. I found that I actually had a platform where I could test stories out, put them out, etc. And I think that was the point. It was not one single point, but a cumulative, different instances that actually brought about.
Okay. How did your years in the corporate world shape the way you now approach myth and meaning?
Well, the corporate world is, uh, how do I put it nicely? It's one of those challenges. For example, it's like, when Jason had to go and kill the Minotaur in the labyrinth. You figure it out. If you figure out the way, it's easy. If you don't, you're going to suffer, you're going to struggle, you're going to probably get killed. So when I actually spent so many years there and then decided that I wanted to do something else, I realized that even while I was working, no matter what the situation is, I always took refuge in stories of people who overcome obstacles. And I think that is huge, when you're actually working for a company or when you're working for a big corporation, where things might never go the way you plan. And then you improvise, you improve, you don't make the same mistakes. And there's plenty of lessons from mythology, which I have helped me actually cope up with things, because I would just say, okay, Hercules did this when he could, killed an Indian lion. So probably that's the way I need to go and approach. It teaches you strategy. It teaches you how to deal with people. It teaches you how to predict or forecast stuff. So there's a lot of lessons that you can take from mythology and implement it in the corporate world, if you ask it. But it's just that you need to ask the right questions and pick the right examples. You do that, it's actually a blueprint for the workplace.
Okay, I'm going to digress a little bit. I want you to cover about your childhood and your academic training and and your career training and how it took you to all of these different locations in the world and then brought you back to India. So can you just give us a brief synopsis of your journeys?
Sure. So I think almost all my schooling I did it in Dubai. And then I moved back to India for my undergrad studies, where I did it in hotel management and catering science, basically hospitality management. That was my basic qualification. I worked as a bartender for in different cities in India for a couple of years, because I was whole caught up in the cocktail movie had just come out. And Tom Cruise, blew my mind. So I was like, that's the life I want to live. So I lived that life for a while, and then I moved to Malta. It was fun. It was fun, but it's a young man's game. The older you get, you realize that, probably, yeah, you should probably look at something else.
Body can't do that for too long.
No, I think after 4 years of night shifts, my biological clock completely reset. I couldn't sleep at night. I couldn't wake up in the morning. There was no sunlight. So, take a call when you realize that your body is not responding.
Correct. Continue.
Yeah. So then I worked in India and, did stuff all around India, basically for quite a few years. And then I moved to Malta, where I went for my master. I did my master's in creativity and innovation at the Edward de Bono Institute. And that's literally when the whole mythology thing rekindled itself, because I went to see the temples in Malta, which were supposedly the oldest in Europe. And the fact that they had so many churches there, each of them having a history and a story, etc. And it's a really small country. So the density of history in that small island really started me talking. And then I did a TED talk when I was in Malta on how innovation can be a source of inspiration for for modern times. And that literally got me researching and studying. And then, moved to Dubai once again, worked there, and then finally, moved back to India and spent some time traveling around India and working here as well. COVID made me sit at home. That made me start MythLok as a small project just to keep me busy, because work had slowed down. But then that just spiraled. It became something that I became really passionate about, and really didn't mind putting 12, 14 hours a day behind it.
Okay. So now currently MythLok is a website.
So it's a MythLok. MythLok is a website. We have a podcast. We have a YouTube channel, social media channels, etc. Yeah. So pretty much, wherever I can get my voice out, I put it out there.
Okay. What is it about mythology that continues to draw people in even across the centuries?
Well, if you look at it, man has always had questions. Yeah. And he's never got a definite answer. So even if, even today, if someone says that they believe in a particular religion, they're still questioning, and if you look at Indian mythology and the Vedic system, it encourages questions, because they always say, you are a seeker until you find the answer. And at that point, you become enlightened. So you're no longer human. So it's a constant process of seeking. And people have faced the same issues all throughout history, love, hate, anger, jealousy, all these human emotions haven't changed. And if you look at mythology, every story about there has some element that you can probably relate to at your present point of time. And the fact that visual media has really helped, bring that about, with movies and stories and web series, etc., really keeps, the fascination alive because you can always find something to relate to in terms of mythology.
Right. Are there myths that you feel are especially relevant today?
Well, if you look at myths and, the struggles faced by mortal characters, whether it's deceit, whether they've been heartbroken and stuff, it always resonates even in today's world. Because, like I said, there's hunger, love, death. These are questions that we haven't got answers to. And we look for references everywhere. So any mythologies that's related to struggle, to dealing with loss, dealing with love, dealing with ambition, all these stories, regardless of which culture they're from, relate to every human being even today. So, I think more than the whole concept of gods creating stuff and gods blessing people, it's always been the stories of humans in those mythologies, or mortals as I call them, because I really don't like the word heroes and villains, because I believe every individual is motivated by what they think is right. Even the villain, the worst villain in the world, thinks what he's doing is right. So I really don't want to categorize them as heroes and villains. So mortals and the journeys that they've been through have just inspired people even all throughout these years. And I believe that is the mythology, or that is the angle of storytelling that people relate to even today. And it's very relevant as well.
Okay. What are one of your favorite or most important mythologies that first attracted you or inspired you more than any of the others?
Well, to be honest, it's all started with Indian mythology. So for me, that was my opening, and you could call it my gateway drug to the world of mythology. That's something that, I'm fascinated by even today. Because the whole concept of the mythology, or the, belief system, is that you are free to believe whatever you want to believe in, as long as you do it with a pure heart. So people say that, Hinduism, Sanatana, and Indian mythology has 30,000 gods. I mean, if there are 5 billion people who believe in it, you could have 5 billion gods. It really doesn't matter, because what you're doing is you are believing in, a form of the god, or a manifestation of the god, rather than the supreme being himself. So when that actually comes in, the possibilities and the stories and local folklore, like if you travel in India, you go from, let's say, you go 100 miles up north or south, you'll come across new local deities or new local gods that they believe in. Every village has their own protector god. So when these things come in, and then you try to bridge how they connect to the overall concept of worship, or more than worship, for me, it's about the stories of how they came about, what they do, etc. It gives an unbelievable number of possibilities that you can explore. So Indian has always been there, but of late, I've been completely fascinated by Filipino mythology, because it's something that, has blown my mind when I went into it. Philippines is a collection of thousands of islands, and almost every island has their own version of a creator god, a sun god, a moon god, etc. And they all have different stories. So as a culture, they're one. They've probably been united because of the Spanish, con- conquistadors coming in, etc. But that mythology has left me completely fascinated.
Do you when you need direction or grounding?
Wow. So for me, it's always been stories that talk about resilience, that teach you, you don't come across failure, but just keep going. And in every mythology, there's always that hero who faced difficulties in life, who faced issues, who faced, competition, or you could say opposition from really strong forces. But then it was not only his skills, but his sheer resilience and his ability to not give up, to move forward. So, an example, would be one of my favorite stories would be the story of Bhima, who is one of the Pandavas in Mahabharata, one of the five brothers. So he is supposedly physically the most strongest of them, but mentally the weakest, as in he has a very kind heart, but he's physically very strong. So one day his wife actually comes across a flower and says, "I love this. Can you get me some more?" And then he just goes on a quest just to get his wife flowers. He kills numerous demons, he meets numerous gods, he gets introduced to completely different monsters in his journey, all for the purpose of making his wife happy. So that whole journey is a journey of how he realized that physical strength is not enough. When he realized that he probably has too much of an ego, when he needs to be humble. So there are multiple stories that he goes on that journey and then he comes back. And then at the end of the day, it's something as simple as his wife keeps a flower on her hair and 2 days later the flower is dead. So, it's something so trivial where you are going to push yourself to the max because of that fleeting moment of success that you feel. So this is, a story that really, stuck with me from as a child. But then as you go through and you listen to, probably Ulysses or Odysseus and his trials and tribunals, his Achilles and his quest. So stories where heroes actually went through trouble, went through emotions and had transformation and change. I think they stick with me the most. And I turn to them when, I'm feeling lost and whether I should give up and, do something else.
It was really fascinating to me because, I went to school at UCLA. When I took my first Greek mythology course, I mean, I was totally, totally blown away. Well, it wasn't even a Greek mythology course. It was like a classics course. And I took my first classics course. It wasn't even my major. I mean, I was a biochemistry major. And then I took a whole year of lower division classics. Then I took like another year of upper division classics. I mean, the stories were just so fascinating. Ulysses, Odysseus, just all of the different stories that we really never even heard of. And all of these various different classics, it was just so incredibly eye-opening to me and fascinating, and it was something I never even knew I had an interest in. Why do you think these stories survive cultural shifts, migrations, and generations?
Well, in a way, these stories connect people to their cultural history, And what happens is, for example, migrations, like my personal story, I grew up in Dubai. The only connection I had with India was probably that 1 month a year when I visited. But what I carried with me were all those stories and all those connections and the kind of history that I felt, yes, that's what I connect to. If you look around the world, it's people looking for connection or people looking for a base of what they can connect with, a culture they can connect with. And today it becomes even more important because almost, half the world is not living in cultures where they're traditionally from. Everyone's working, everyone's living in huge multicultural cosmopolitan cities. And that becomes, these stories will transcend time because that's one thing that they feel they can always connect to or go back to. And that becomes, a big issue or a question of identity when people actually ask themselves. And I believe as an American, no one else up in the world would feel that more than you guys because you're constantly questioned on your identity when, you're American. You've lived there all your life, but then they keep, asking you, okay, but where are your parents from? I get that a lot from my friends in the US. So it becomes a question of how do you connect? And mythology and stories is your easiest connect. You really don't have to know your history. You don't have to know which king ruled which kingdom in which, empire, but you can always talk about stories because they are timeless. And all you need to do is just look at it in that manner.
What do myths reveal about human nature?
That no matter which country you're from, which part of the world you're from, you're all the same. If you look at every myth around the world, if you look at the gods themselves, let's not talk about the mortals, let's talk about the gods. Every mythology has that one god has a quick temper. One god, you have a god of love who's meant to, spread love around the world. You always have a god for wealth, which is again very important to humans. So every god out there has been given a role which is important to human beings. And deep down inside, all as humans have the same basic emotion and same basic needs. We just projected it in a way that was more relevant or more culturally or more geographically fit to us. It's only the geography and the way they behave that differs. If you look at, for example, if you look at a culture that's predominantly in the far north, like the Yupik or the Inuit, the whole mythology or the whole gods revolves around the snow, around frost, around northern lights, around ice and stuff. But then they have the same kind of gods as someone living in, let's say, Polynesia or Haiti, where they have the voodoo culture. It's always the same kind of gods doing the same things. It's just that what they wear is different, what they're called is different, and it's predominantly due to geography. If you have island cultures, their gods are more oceanic or aquatic oriented. If they're mountainous, they are more into the mountains and the grasslands they live in. If you go down to Africa, you have the amazing, opulent or prosperous Greek gods. But then you also have the Bushmen of the sun who have gods who are or deal with the bare basic elements of life.
How do you see mythology helping people make sense of their own lives?
Well, if you look at it as, let me say this, when we were all kids, we used to have, on, I think every curriculum has this, a class called moral science or moral studies where they teach you the supposed good things, how you're supposed to behave. If you look at stories as something similar or mythology as something similar rather than the religious aspect behind it, I think every story has something to teach, whether it's a story of how, greed can consume a human being. Where, let's say, King Midas, he wanted everything that he touched to gold until he touched his own daughter, whom he actually loved more than gold, and she became a statue of gold. Or how greed can influence you, or how unparalleled ambition. Icarus, when he flew too close to the sun, that, don't forget what you do, or don't be too ambitious, or let your ambitions so high that you take unwanted risks. So all these stories, if you just remove the aspect of religion or God or worship from cultures around the world, you have a treasure trove of stories from which you can learn from, which you can really imbibe in your life. And I think that is one mistake that we all make today. Immediately when we think of mythology, we connect them to gods and worship, and then it's a whole different dynamic that comes into play.
Okay, okay. Of all the mythological gods, which one do you feel you connect with the most?
Well, with the dreadlocks, it's probably, Shiva. But yeah, but if you look at gods, I think I connect with a lot of the gods who are associated with passion. Because you have God, it's not just love, no, so I'm doing something, gods who bless you, who remove obstacles in your path, who actually are flawed themselves. So it's very recently that, the gods in mythology became flawless. If otherwise, throughout mythology, every god had a flaw. That's why you needed another god to, complement that flaw and so to ensure that the human beings don't suffer. So I like gods who are flawed, whether it's Hanuman who does not know his own powers, who needs to be constantly reminded, whether it's Thor, who, not the Marvel Thor, the real Thor, who is extremely short tempered and cannot control his anger, whether it's Ogun from Yoruba mythology, who has this tendency to literally be very harsh with the human beings, or even Anubis from Egyptian mythology, who is flawed to an extent with jealousy, is a big part of his character flaw. So all these things, and I love the trickster gods as well. Whether it's Nancy from the Akan or from Ghana, or whether it's the Coyote from the American mythology from the Cherokee tribe, etc. Trickster gods are amazing because they play with that line, what's moral, what's not moral, and their balance on that tightrope between what's right and what's wrong is just brilliant. So these are the type of gods that I relate to. I wouldn't want to pick one particular god because, as far as I know, they're all pretty much the same. So the core element or the core basis, which I would say is very interesting, one which I closely connect to, would be trickster gods and the flawed gods.
Okay, MythLok covers stories from all over the world. How do you choose which cultures or figures to highlight?
Well, I would say it's a third each. So one third of it is influenced by, the business element, or I wouldn't call it business. I would say the fact that you want to be shown up on Google, right? You want people to read what you do. It says no point putting it out there if no one's reading. So one, what are the ones that people actually search for, what people want to read? That's one. The second element or the second part of it is what I want to focus on because I want to bring out as many mythologies as possible. So currently we have 200 mythologies. So I like to explore different mythologies and bring at least one or two characters out in the front. So that takes care of the second element. And the third is purely driven by the people who visit MythLok. So when they come in and they do a search for a particular god on MythLok, it comes into my system and then I add that particular character, god, demigod, hero, whatever, I add them to our list. So that's how we build characters. So it's part business, part what I want, and most importantly, what the people want.
Are there myths that you feel are especially relevant today?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's a cultural myth, but definitely tropes or archetypes. The hero's journey, Joseph Campbell did brilliantly by putting out a complete archetype or a journey structure that they can relate to even today. And it's very much used in business talks and in management schools. That's very relevant today. I think that's the most important type of myth, or the hero's journey, where they go from being handed over a mission all the way to completing it. Because it takes different stages that they have to go through, whether it's accepting it, going through trouble, getting allies, moving forward, finding a solution, executing the plan, and then finally coming back victorious. Any hero you take in mythology goes through this exact same framework. And I feel that even today, whether you are starting off your career in the corporate world or you want to become a musician, you are going to face each of these things till you achieve success, which is you actually end up becoming a hero. So all these stories with the hero element to it, I think it's still relevant.
What differences or similarities do you notice when comparing mythologies from different cultures?
Well, the differences, like I mentioned before, are purely geographic. So if you are a mythology, let's say you are from the Berber culture in ancient Algeria, what's today, your mythology will be about desert creatures, will be about, oases and, fertile lands, etc. Look at Egypt, and they built their whole mythology along the Nile. So almost you have at least 5 or 6 gods that are responsible for different aspects of the Nile. Similarly, if you look at, let's say, Maori culture, many of their gods deal with the sea because they have been living, they have a huge coastline and they have water all around them, revealing that many gods are associated with different aspects of the sea, marine life, water, storms, rain, etc. Similarly, you go to gods of fire, they have gods of fire everywhere. They have gods of wind everywhere. They have gods of wealth everywhere. So all these types of gods, they're similar all throughout. The only thing that differs is the geography or how you go ahead and present them. And if you look at timelines, the older the civilization or the older the mythology, the more complex or the more number of gods you have. You get closer to what we are today, the number of gods decrease, the power of human beings increase. So if you look,
A level of understanding increases. Also, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it seems like what you're interjecting is that a lot of the mythologies and gods were placed upon the difficulties presented to them by the environments they lived in and the struggles, excuse me, that they had to go through or the catastrophes they had to experience based upon the geography and location they lived in. So they had to have a way of understanding and or explaining these things.
absolutely. Now, I can give you an example, something that's closer to you. For example, in Hawaii, they have, I think, 4 gods that's associated with mountains and volcanoes, different aspects of the volcano, because that's a crucial element in their environment. But you wouldn't find a volcano god anywhere in Chinese mythology.
Exactly. 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 How do lesser known traditions contribute to our understanding of global storytelling?
Well, lesser known mythologies are very important, Carl, because otherwise what happens is, could I, take a strong stand on your podcast?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So I think one of the biggest disservices done to mythology was the movie Gods of Egypt.
Okay.
So it was a well-made movie, but you had European white actors playing Egyptian gods. I mean, how far from the truth could you be? Because none of the gods were depicted as being fair-skinned, but you had fair-skinned men who had definite, distinct European features playing Egyptian gods. So it becomes, what happens is when you start doing this, or when you start focusing only on the major ones like Greek or Roman, you start to think that every single mythological character or every single god for that matter looks a certain way. And that is extremely, disrespectful to smaller cultures who probably don't have the resources to put their stories out. I was talking to this student last week, and she asked me, "So, how can if I were to make a movie or I were to do a design of the Filipino god Maria Makiling, who is a god of the mountains, etc., in the Philippines? How can I ensure that she is not disrespected?" I said, don't get a blonde actress to play the role. Simple as that. You need to stay true to a lot of cultural elements that come in, and exposure to all these things gives people the freedom to start thinking that yes, if there is a god from Papua New Guinea, they probably look like native Papua New Guineans. That's how they imagine them. They wouldn't imagine a god who looks completely different from them in any matter. And this stands true even today, because I believe in the Bible also they say we are made in the image of God. So how can you describe something that really doesn't look anything like the people who it related to? So I think emergence of these smaller mythologies is very important for people all around the world to understand that yes, everyone does not need to look a certain way, especially mythological characters.
For you, what does it mean to bring an ancient story into the modern world?
Well, do you mean visually or do you mean conceptually?
Conceptually. I mean, because, we have to, be able to, conceptualize and rationalize, that. I mean, do you present it just as it was, or do you kind of modify it so that it's better understood in today's light?
Oh, yeah, it definitely needs to, because if you look at many of the stories out there and you look at how our sensibilities are today, it probably doesn't align in many ways. The Incas and Mayas used to believe that human sacrifice was something very noble, but it's completely frowned upon today, and rightfully so. So we do need to, you can't misrepresent what's in the stories. You can't say things that aren't true, but you can always say it with a caveat saying that, listen, this is why they did it. Always explain the why when you tell a story. If you explain that, for example, let's say, yeah, there's stories of incest in different mythologies all around the world. But then why was that, not frowned upon at that point of time? You don't go ahead and completely bash it and say that they probably were uncivilized. So you need to have that balance when you say stories. Don't dumb it down, don't embellish it, but always explain why, so that people today can understand why a certain thing was done at a point.
Balance respect for cultural history with creative interpretation.
Well, one thing, like I said, don't don't dilute the truth. Don't dilute it to an extent wherein it doesn't resemble what it was before. Uh, Marvel has done, I would say, although I completely disagree with their portrayal of Thor, which is nothing like the actual Norse god. You wouldn't believe it, Carl. I still get messages. People send me messages on MythLok saying your article about Loki is wrong. Loki is Thor's brother. I'm like, no, that's in the Marvel universe, not in the actual mythology. If at all, he would be an uncle. He's definitely not an adopted brother. So when you actually play with stuff on those lines, it becomes important, or it's a responsibility of the creator to ensure that people know that this is a retelling or this is a reimagination, rather than just putting it out there and saying that yes, Thor is a Norse god, he's from Asgard. You get all the other aspects right, but then you decide to really fudge many details so that it fits in with your storyline. So I think that is a disservice. But the fact that they did this with Thor actually brought about a huge interest in Norse mythology, leading to many other creative work coming out.
Well, once again, I mean, this is kind of off topic, but we're on the subject of Marvel. Marvel even does that with their own characters and their own history. I mean, if you look, and we're just going to talk about this briefly, but if you look at the Incredible Hulk and its original comic book series, the Incredible Hulk was almost impossible to be beat. You want to know right?
Yeah,
The madder he got, the larger he
yeah,
got.
you got it. True.
And so, see, you do not see that. You do not see that in the Marvel interpretations of their comic books. And that's one of the things, once again, that a lot of people are upset about. When you know the history of something and then people deviate from that history, but don't explain that this is a deviation of the original history, then you create a lot of controversy and misunderstandings. And so, it's very important, like you stated, that if you're going to, tell a story that's different than the original, you have to let people know that this is a reinterpretation of, this original character, this original god, or whatever else. In your experience, how do younger audiences respond to mythology today?
Well, it's quite interesting, to be honest, Carl, because I see clusters where, people are really, really interested in knowing their past and knowing their cultures and mythology. For example, in the Philippines, there's a huge resurgence of people wanting to know their real history. They're giving up their so-called Spanish influenced modern culture, and the younger generation really wants to get into know that. In India as well, you find a lot of younger generation, really looking forward, really trying to read, because I strongly believe that we had a lost generation in between. My parents, when I asked my mother, listen, okay, why is XYZ like this? And she doesn't have an answer. Her answer is because it's like that. That's the way we were told. We had a huge generation who refused to ask questions. So now, when the younger generation is actually asking questions, I think it becomes a responsibility for whoever is in this field to supply them with the answers, provide them with, as true a retelling as you can. And I see this in the younger generation quite a bit, especially in different parts of, the Baltic region, or, people who are interested, who are from, let's say, a Russian or a Slavic cultural heritage. They are also, really looking back and seeing who Perun is or who Berinas is, etc. So they are going on a resurgence of finding out their history. And I think it is because of the fact that you are getting answers today. So you ask 5 questions, you don't get an answer to 5, you just stop asking questions. But then you ask 5, you get an answer for 3. That leads to another 5 questions, probably you get an answer to 4 of. The younger generation today is interested. They are actually looking at stuff more than what my generation or what my parents' generation they actually were interested in, because at that point of time it was more of globalization. The world is becoming smaller. We are all one world. But now the cultural pride sort of a thing is developing in different parts of the world. Especially if you look at Brazil, people are starting to look at their ancestors. The Mapuche, the Toltecs, the Musica, the Moche, etc. They're looking at them not with the idea that they were barbarians or they were uncivilized people living in the past and their history was probably everything is nonsense, but they are looking at it with a different angle. I wouldn't say it's not definitely not from a religious angle, but definitely from a history or from I want to know where I'm from kind of a thing. It's become a matter of pride to say, yes, my ancestors, trace back to the Mayans. So it's different in different cultures, and I think that that's a really good thing.
Well, I mean, I believe that what you're saying is correct. I think a big influence of that, though, is probably the internet. People have more access to the knowledge now. So, when they used to go and ask us or their parents, we'd say, well, we don't know, or it's just that way. Now they can go and look on the internet and get a whole different world background, and it just sparks their interest in their imagination to want to research and find out more. For a long time, I didn't even know the Spanish had any, how can I say it, influence over the Philippines. I thought it was so strange. Why do all these Filipinos have these Spanish last names? And it was fascinating to me, but now it's not just with the culture. You find, a lot of the younger Filipinos, they want to get into the various instruments and music of their individual islands and the lure and the religions of that particular island or group of beliefs. So it's incredible. What role do digital platforms play in renewing interest in these stories?
Well, like you brilliantly put it, the internet gives you the answers. But another thing that actually helps is, for example, a digital podcast like this connects people to other people whom they might never have the opportunity to listen to. So earlier when, let's say when we were kids or, when our parents were young, to get answers, you either asked someone older or you went to, let's say, a priest or someone who's associated with religion. And they probably had their own motive behind telling you the answers to the questions, or probably, a bit, from a religious angle. But now today, you can always You can choose what angle you want to listen to. You want to listen to a hardline guy who believes that, yes, everything is conservative, everything needs to be, from that perspective. You're free to do that. You want to listen to a person who feels that everything is more liberal or everything is more connected. You can do that as well. So you can choose your path because of the digital age. You can choose five different people saying, having five completely different voices and opinions on the exact same matter. And you can research and find out information. Now, it's not only about finding information, it's also the ability to put out information. Like you have some brilliant minds whose books I've read, for example, Filipino mythology, Professor Lacado. Then you have Professor Titi, who did a lot of African studies. You have, a lot of Donninger, who did a brilliant piece on Southeast Asian mythology. So these people at their time when they were putting out books and academic journals did not have the reach they should and rightly deserve. People like this who have written amazing studies, who've done brilliant research, they didn't have the means. And today, the internet is allowing even, enthusiasts like me to put out my opinion and reach so many different people out there. So I think the digital age, we missed a lot of experts who probably should have, been given the liberty of using the internet and the digital space.
Okay. You're also a life and career coach. How do you use mythological themes in your work with your clients?
I use it all the time because once the moment you tell people that, okay, I'm going to talk to you or I'm going to advise you on this thing, immediately they look at us as a teacher. And, first thing you do when you see a teacher is you switch off. But then when you come and tell them, listen, let me tell you the story, immediately they're interested. They give you that extra piece of attention that you probably deserve for you to get your point across. So I use mythological stories wherever I can. I don't restrict myself to any one culture. For example, if I'm doing a talk to a bunch of Indians, I don't stick only to Indian mythology. What I probably do is start with Indian mythology so I get them interested, but then I bring in stories from all the other cultures as well so that the message goes across. And it also goes across that you could be in different situations, but always work out things in the end.
What universal lessons within myths that help people navigate personal change have you discovered?
Well, like I mentioned before, the concept of dealing with loss or dealing with betrayal. That's a common theme that most mythologies around the world have dealt with and which we still feel very closely. It affects us. Breakup affects 90% of people out there. They've gone through that in their lives. Mythological themes such as this can really help. Love stories, stories of sacrifice, stories of where people actually had to take unpleasant decisions for the greater good of mankind. So these are stories that, I think people can relate to today and will continue to influence people for a very, very long time. Because these are the basic raw human emotions, without which, we wouldn't be human anymore.
Okay. What stories do you turn to when you need direction or grounding?
I need grounding. Well, it's always been it's been one of my favorite stories, the story of, these hero twins from Mayan mythology. And they go into the underworld, they defeat the underworld in a game of ball, and they come back. So that fact that, you could probably be at your worst or, be at the worst place possible, but still come back and make a journey out of it always gives me courage. So whenever I feel that, when I'm sorry, when I'm too happy, I don't restrict myself. But when I'm feeling really low, I'll say, no, you can always, make a story out of this later. So then let's just keep moving. The
Excuse me, has working with mythology changed the way you understand your own journey?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because, for example, we were all tuned in a certain way as kids, men shouldn't cry or, you need to be strong because you're the oldest in the family. And so many other tropes that's actually, you're put into or roles that you're put into as kids, which you subconsciously you take up. But you need a complete rewiring as an adult because they don't hold true anymore. Once you finish college and you're out into the world, it's a completely different world out there and you need to figure things out. And at that point of time, for me, these stories actually helped. And I've become a much more patient guy because, throughout mythology, the guy who's impatient, the guy who could not wait, always never won. It's always the guy who, just took a step back, thought about it and, went about it slowly in a planned way who always ended up victorious. So that's been one major character change that I've seen myself go through as a person after I got involved in mythology a lot more.
What inspires you when you write or craft new content for MythLok?
Well, the first thing that I keep in mind always is how can I ensure that I'm not getting false information? Because there's a lot of misinformation out there. So that's very important to me. And the second thing is how can I make this easy for people to read? I don't want people to read articles on MythLok and get bored halfway through because it's too academic. I want it to be an easy read. I want it to be like not something you refer to write your thesis on, but something you have a quick doubt level. Let me just pop on MythLok and see who this is. Or you see a subtle reference in a movie and you want to go to somewhere to get a quick, recap of who that is. You can always come on MythLok. To give you for example, the Netflix series Chaos, once it came out, we had a huge hit on Greek mythology on our website because people were literally looking, who is Zeus? Okay. Because they had completely fictionalized versions and they're unapologetic about it. And that's the good thing about Chaos. They don't pretend to be the truth. They pretend to be modern versions of the gods. So now you have the freedom to depict Zeus as that. He does it brilliant. The actor who plays Jeff Goldblum, who plays Zeus. So that gives you that freedom. So that becomes very important for me, so that I can ensure that it's easy to digest, easy to read, and easy to access.
Do you have a process for researching books from cultures outside of your own?
Yes, I actually have this policy where I make sure that I try to pick up at least one academic journal about that mythology or that character, something that's peer reviewed, something that's accepted, and then base everything else on folklore, on mythology, on not mythology, folklore, and let's say oral traditions. So I try to connect with people on LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram who actually post about this and who is from that culture. I've talked with, Maori people who have a Maori tradition to discuss how, the Maori gods actually influence them, what the stories were. Even if it's completely different from what I researched, I feel that getting their opinion or at least knowing how to pronounce the names properly is important. So that's a process which I do because most of the pronunciations you get online are westernized versions and probably not the exact way it's supposed to be said.
What challenges do you face when presenting stories that have many versions or interpretations?
Well, it's easy and it's difficult. It's easy when the other person has no clue about it because they will listen to you. But if a person has even little bit knowledge, and then it becomes a debate. And so I try to always prefer saying that, listen, these are oral traditions that's been passed down orally. So one person could have said one thing, but the three people listening to it might have interpreted it in multiple different ways. There's this story, the story that I tell most people is that there was this monastery, in the south of France, run by monks from the Celtic period who moved there so that they could have peace. And the monastery was built on people being recruited from different parts of the British Isles and sent there. So over years, they followed this strict lifestyle where, they completely are stripped down to the bare essentials. They are celibate. They, eat anything apart from fruit. So they live a very, very simple life and they spend their days in prayer and service, etc. So one fine day, one new priest came in or a new monk came in and decided that they have all these amazing texts in their archive, in their library, and we need to digitize them so that it's safe and it can be passed down to the future generations. It's not safe to keep it in its current form. So they, get two of the senior priests to go ahead, take out those books, read everything, and digitize them using the help of modern technology. On day 3, they suddenly hear two priests crying in the library, and they all run down and say, "Oh my God, what happened? What happened?" And in between tears, one of the priests says, "They said celebrate, not celebrate. They said celebrate, not celebrate." So it's the oral tradition. It can get misinterpreted. It can be, that that's the risk we have to take.
Okay, okay. We're going to enter that part of the flow. Show flip mode. So you get to ask me 3 questions. So what are your 3 questions?
Okay, so from the moment you said it, there's one question that's been on my mind that I really wanted to ask you. Alan, you're an American. Do you think about your mythological or cultural roots? How do you look at your cultural roots?
That's difficult for me. Because part of my cultural roots is slave African, of course. And even though I've dealt and talked to some individuals to help me do a family tree, it hasn't been a lack of, interest on my end. I'd have a few conversations with them, offer to pay them, and they never got to do that. So that particular side is, kind of opaque to me. But then on the other side of my cultural ancestry, I have American Indian. And that becomes also very complex because there were dark-skinned American Indians, and there were American Indians that were so dark-skinned, they were classified as Negroes. Then you had the whole situations of when slaves ran away and actually got away from the plantation. Most of them actually integrated in with the Indian cultures. During the period before, there was a separation of the North and South, and you had, the slave culture down South and the free culture. There was nowhere to run to be free, so you had to escape, the white population, and the only way you could do that was to run to the Indian population. And so it's just kind of like a mixed ancestry that we have no, how can I say it? We have no concept of. And I think, for me as an African American, I think that's what plagues us a lot. We have that lack of cultural history that almost everybody else has.
Yeah, I see that a lot when I speak to, African Americans, when I speak to people from the Caribbean. They have this sense of lost identity, which, I feel that is tough for a lot of people. So I totally can get what you're saying. My second question to you, Carl, is you've been doing this for a while now, talking to people and stuff. What do you think people love talking about?
You know what? Because this show's a little bit different. And the strange thing about it, when I went into podcasting, I didn't look at any other podcast shows. So I just did my own thing. And so for me, even today, it's a question as to, you know, I have a show all about us, Africa and diaspora, but I tell everybody, everybody's from somewhere. So we're part of each other. I don't care what culture or what skin color you are, what religion you are. You're free to come here and tell your story. And so I think there's just a lot of different people from what I can see are just interested in sharing their story, their history, and their special aspects of their culture with other people. I believe that's why they come to my show. I mean, but I can't, it's very difficult for me to really answer that question because I didn't look or research podcast shows. I developed a
No, no. What
podcast.
I meant was, sorry to interrupt you, Carl. I think, I probably didn't put out forward my question correctly. It was when a person's on your show, you talk to them about different things. You talk to them about their work, about their life. So which part of that conversation do you find the people to be most excited about the speaking?
I don't I don't really see a common thing that people like to speak about one area versus another. It's different for everybody. I think what they like, or what I perceive they like, is they like the depth of the questioning that occurs in my show, and it allows them to unpack and bring some things forward in a podcast that they normally wouldn't. And so it's just different for everybody. We're all individuals. So I don't see any common theme. Like I don't see like, okay, most people like to talk about their family. Most people like to talk about their jobs. I do. The one area I do think a lot of people come on this show, they may have something that they are currently working on or they're currently promoting. And that is the one common theme I think there is with most people. They may have a book or they may have a website or they may have, a program or they may have a show that's coming up. But we talk more about other things than we do that, even though we always incorporate that in. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, no, you answered exactly the way I assumed it would be, because during this podcast, you made me think, which usually doesn't happen. It's usually like, questions, I pretty much know where they're going. I pretty much give the answers, but multiple times I had to stop, and think, okay, now that's deep. Let me, make sure I give a good answer.
Well, that's what we do. We challenge people. And that's the thing about I will say about this podcast show. I call it unpacking. We make you unpack. So we kind of get to, talk about some things on a different level that sometimes you have to think about it and really unpack it in a manner that you don't do on other shows. Third
And
question.
to be honest, yeah. So my third question is, so,
Oh, no, we're getting ready to say.
Ari, you have to say that this is, yeah, to be honest, this is exactly the way how mythologies were made. You had one person speaking and you had one person, taking notes and, jotting it down.
Correct. Third question.
Yeah. Yeah. Third question is, Carl. So I love to put this across to people, whenever I meet them, is that if you could reimagine yourself as a mythical character, any mythical character from anywhere around the world, who would it be and why that character?
Two characters. Lord Brahma.
Yeah.
I'm just fascinated that, the combination of technology, creator, and then, right close to Lord Brahma would be Viracocha.
Viracocha.
Well, he's another creator god. But those two really kind of, make my hair stand up on end. And for various different reasons, because I believe that, I believe that the two cultures, in a sense, are misunderstood.
And since you love, Lord Brahma a lot, I think you brought him up twice. Let me give you a fascinating piece of information. India is such a huge country. We only have one Brahma temple, and he's not worshipped here because in the story goes that he was cursed, but that he would never be worshipped because of something that he did.
Right. So
So what actually happened? Yeah. So it's because he was the god of creation, he created everything, and then he fell in love with one of his creation. So he was cursed by Shiva, saying that that's not what you're supposed to do. So you cannot fall in love with something you created. So you'll be cursed. You'll never be worshipped.
But he's a failed god, just like you said. He's not a failed god, he's a flawed god.
Flawed God.
He's a flawed
Exactly.
god.
Yeah.
Okay, looking ahead, what do you hope MythLok becomes in the years ahead?
I really hope it becomes a place where people can actually share what they think about mythology and learn from others. I want it to become like a community where people can read, give their opinion, give their versions, where true believers or true people from that particular culture can come and give their personal perspectives, not academic, not research worthy, but what they've listened to as kids or what they've been passed on from a cultural perspective. Where it's not just myth in researching and writing, but people come in and contribute or add on. For example, an article about Viracocha, I have it on the website, but I want people from the culture to come and say, listen, my grandmother told me this, or my aunt told me this, or in my village, there's a pyramid that has a stone carving that depicts this. So I want people to come in and start adding on their personal reflections to all these cultures and cultural figures that we have on. I think that would be my ultimate objective.
Are there new regions or traditions you want to explore more deeply?
Yeah, I think the Oceanian cultures, Polynesia, Melanesia, Micronesia, these are very, very underrepresented. It's very alien to me as well in terms of how the cultures are, because all of them, from what I've seen, are marine oriented, or they have a lot of things that connected to the ocean currents, winds, etc. So it would be a very interesting deep dive once I get into it.
How do you see mythology contributing to global understanding or unity today?
Well, people start listening to the stories, they would understand that there is more that's common between me and you than what separates us. So
Correct, correct.
I think that's the biggest thing that mythology can do.
What would you say to someone who feels disconnected from their cultural nodes or roots?
Well, start with stories, just keep an open mind and start with stories. Don't believe in anything, don't trust anything. Just listen to stories because that gives you a very good idea about how people thought and how they reacted and how they recorded stuff 500, 600 years ago, or 1,000 years in some cases, 5,000. So that's probably your easiest way for you to really connect and see if you feel those same things in some way. And then, you can actually start connecting, you can explore, and you have the complete freedom to take information from any source that you want to, rather than being stuck on a particular path that people put you down, especially when you move into formalized religion.
And finally, what does it mean to you to keep the magic of ancient stories alive?
Well, right now it means everything to me because I use this as guiding principles in stuff that I do, stuff that I teach, how I bring up my son. I have a completely rambunctious 9-year-old who thinks I'm really cool because I have a YouTube channel. Surprisingly. So when uh, when I tell him stuff, I find it easier for me to get concepts or values into his head when I talk about stories. I talk in stories rather than me preaching, making him sit down and preaching about right and wrong. So I think that, mythology will play a huge role in that aspect, and I think it should.
So, to all of my listeners who are interested in you, your mythologies, and your stories, how do they contact and connect with you?
Well, the best place is MythLok, the website. So that's mythlok.com. We have close to 200 mythologies on the website. So if you can find your cultures, great, read the stories. If you want to know more, you can always connect via social media, our YouTube channel, where we have quite an active community of people contributing, commenting, and stuff. And you can always write to us as well at hi@mythlok.com. And we say quite proudly that we respond to every single comment on our videos or on our social media. So if you write to us, we will write to you back.
Okay, Nitten, thank you for taking us on this journey into the world's mythologies. Your book reminds us that even in the oldest stories, you can feel alive, relevant, and deeply human. To our listeners, you can explore global myths, characters, and traditions through Nitten's work on MythLok and his storytelling platforms. All of that information, all of his links will be included in our promos in the show notes. This has been the All About Us podcast, where we uncover the narratives that connect us across history, culture, and imagination. Until next time, stay curious, stay open, and keep exploring the stories that shape your world. Have a great day.
Thank you, John.